Welcome back. We're here in Matthew 18 today, continuing along to see what Jesus says for us. We see here that this chapter is the start of the fourth of 5 discourses, 5 teaching sections in a sense, where Jesus is just telling a lot of things and describing to us what our way of life should look like. So we're looking at this fourth one here today, and it highlights a lot of different characteristics about discipleship. So we'll go ahead and dive right on into this chapter. We have so many different themes that jump out to us as we see how we're supposed to live. So as we look at verses 1 through 5, it starts with this beautiful story. Jesus puts a child before them and tells us how this is what it looks like to enter the kingdom of heaven. So Lee, what do you see here as we look at this story?
Yeah, the event is initiated by a question from the disciples. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And I would like to say that this was the only time they asked such a foolish question, and that Jesus' answer would have made it impossible for them to ever ask it again. The fact is, they asked this question on several occasions, and it's a little sad that Jesus' followers were so interested in greatness and rank and status, even in God's kingdom, where mercy and grace are the prevailing priorities. But they do, and I'm not beating up on them, because I know that there's a strong temptation in my life and probably in other believers' lives as well to think in terms of hierarchy and who's the greatest and who's the most important. Jesus pretty much shuts that type of thinking down. So here, in answer to the question, as you say, he decides to use an object lesson. Yeah. It took me a long time to figure out that children were not especially highly regarded in Jewish society. Had you picked up on that?
I read some about that. Yeah, we think of now that people would treasure their children. That would be a big deal. One thing I found, tell me if you know of something different, was saying, the life expectancy was different, or especially when you're a child. So it's almost, why would you get attached to a child when you don't know how long they'll live? But also just that, they weren't treated as really a person until they grew up to a certain age. Does that sound right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly my impression. Yeah, so it's a little different than the way our society, I think, mainly values children. So it's worth pointing that out, I think, to show that Jesus is not using an object lesson of a group of people who were already beloved and worshipped in that culture. They were kind of ignored and looked down on a little bit. So Jesus is doing something important here. So in answer to the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom, Jesus calls his object lesson up, this child, and actually gives 2 lessons combined in one here. The first lesson, teaching, comes in verse 3. Unless you change and become like a child, you will never even enter the kingdom of heaven, let alone be great, which was their question. And then he goes on to explain what he means by become like a child. He says, becomes humble like a child, lowly. You will never, then he comes back to their idea of the greatest in the kingdom. The more humble you are, the more lowly you are, the greater you are. This fits in with Jesus' teachings about the greatest and the least and first and last, fits in. But then his second lesson, teaching, related to this object lesson child is in verse 5. Whoever welcomes such a child in my name welcomes me. So he's really teaching 2 different things here. One is becoming like a child, that's humility, and the other is welcoming people who are not especially highly regarded in society, and that's hospitality. So there's kind of a double teaching here.
There's multiple lessons there. Yeah, those are both crucial to the kingdom and to what greatness looks like. And I love even hospitality. I think often you do remember that that's about service as well. So that all of these things are kind of ways that you're putting yourself on a different level. You're not necessarily trying to raise yourself up. You're saying, no, I'll stoop down and I'll be lower. I'll be humble and I'll serve someone else. I'll, be scrubbing the floor or whatever hospitality might
Washing
look like
feet.
for you. Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
If you're staying on track with us for our reading plan, in our guides that we have here, one of the chapters you will read is Psalm 131, and I just want to read that quickly because it captures a lot of those lessons well of humility. It says, "My heart is not proud, O Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me." And then it goes on, "But I have stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me." And it talks about putting your hope in the Lord. And that's just such a beautiful image. You see, again, the idea of being a weaned child. You're conditioned to depend on your mother in that case. And it's sort of saying that that's how we want to be with God. We're conditioned to depend on God fully, that we're that vulnerable. A weaned child can't really get food anywhere else. They're helpless. That's all they can get is their mother's milk. And that's exactly what we're reading about here, is what it looks like to be okay with being a little helpless. It's kind of an acknowledgement of where we really are, that in the end we're just in God's hands, and that's okay. And that's what true greatness looks like for us. So this is just such a beautiful section for us.
There's one more thing here. The question is, do we take this term child literally as if Jesus is only talking about the way in which we treat children or emulate the humility of children? That's the literal interpretation. Or is he using the word child metaphorically here to mean anyone who is lowly? And I would say that the majority of students of Matthew think that it's the second of those two, that Jesus is talking not just about children age-wise, but any young person, as it were. So like a new believer or someone who's just young in the faith. And so he's saying that we should be humble and not lorded over people. If we're experienced Christians, longtime Christians, think we know it all, we don't lord it over seekers or new converts. So that kind of broadens the teaching here.
That's to think of if you're someone who's been a Christian a while, that you would remember the humility, maybe the wonder that you experienced Jesus when you first became a believer. That's beautiful for us. Yeah.
And so I think in terms of applying this teaching of Jesus, it's appropriate and helpful to apply it to both groups. There's a good lesson here about how we respect and emulate children, but also about these new believers that you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. We'll go ahead on to verses 6 through 9. So this one's has, I guess it feels a little less poetic. Before we're putting a child in the middle, talking about welcoming one. And here we have words about, if you cause a little one to stumble, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. So some harsh images here.
Yeah, well, and it gets worse.
Yeah.
Because the imagery in verse 8 is self-mutilation, right?
There we go. Yeah. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. Better to be maimed and lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into the eternal fire. So yes, some very hard words for us to hear, for us to even want to spend time with, but we're going to spend some time with. Yeah, unpack that, explain that a little more.
We need to start with the fact that Jesus loved and used very effectively a device called hyperbole, which means exaggeration, deliberate exaggeration in order to make a point. And we've seen it many times, so I'm sure our watchers here are aware of this, but this is another prime example of the use of hyperbole, where Jesus really hammers home a point by the use of exaggerated language. The previous passage, we were talking about being humble, right? Here we're talking about stumble, the problems that come with humble and stumble. And look at verse 6. There's that phrase, the little ones. And we're pretty sure that he's still talking about young believers, new believers who are still maybe struggling with their faith and trying to get started on the path of Christian maturity. So we need to be careful as mature believers, the actions and words that we use, the things that we say and teach, the example that we show, doesn't cause them to trip up or get entrapped into patterns of behavior that we can handle in our maturity. And so he said that's not good. You don't want to do that. And he uses that exaggerated language about drowning yourself in the sea if you cause someone else to stumble. The word, listen to the Greek word here, scandalon. Mm-hmm. It's the word scandal. Mm-hmm. It's the word that we get scandal from. And so he says, don't scandalize these people. A scandalon in Greek meant a trap, like a bird trap or an animal trap, you know? Okay. So he says, I know I'm sure you don't intend this, but sometimes our behavior as mature believers can actually entrap others into activities. I'm trying to think of a practical example here of something that I feel like I can handle or do just fine as a mature believer, but that might cause somebody else a problem. Well, here, one example. Suppose you're a mature Christian who understands that the New Testament teaches that drinking an alcoholic beverage is not a sin. Mm-hmm. It's drunkenness. That's a sin. So you, as a mature believer, may have claimed the freedom, and I think this is legitimate. I would support this decision. Legitimate to occasionally, let's say, have a glass of wine or something with supper. But what if your brother's an alcoholic? Mm-hmm. And I mean your little brother or your sister or your sister-in-law or something like that, or your cousin, whatever. So when you're at a family gathering, do you act in your freedom in a way that might cause them or tempt them? Oh, look, they're Christian, they're a mature Christian. I guess it's okay for me. Yeah. Anyway,
you bring a bottle of wine when maybe that isn't the best situation. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just one example. Maybe people can think of how that might work in their own lives, but there's an important principle at work here that we need to take really seriously.
That we don't want to cause other people to stumble. That's important.
But then the second part isn't about causing other people to stumble, right?
It's about yourself, that if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, and yes, that exaggeration again, cut it off. What do you think we want to make sure we hear out of that?
Yeah, I think this is self-discipline, where the first one is respect for other people and any potential weaknesses or points of stumbling in their lives that we need to take very seriously and self-discipline ourselves in those settings. Here, the self-discipline is avoiding behaviors or thought patterns that we know are actually dangerous for ourselves. And that's important too. Jesus clearly is not talking about suicide or self-mutilation here. He's not advocating that. But he does say, conscientiously remove from your life anything that could cause others or yourself to stumble. And that takes a lot of self-discipline.
I think the exaggeration serves to really show us how important this is. Sometimes we can take sin less seriously. It's no big deal, just doing a little bit of this or that, whatever it might be. And here it's saying, no, it's a very big deal. You want to stop it in its tracks. You want to make sure you're paying attention to how you're leading someone else astray or to how you're affecting yourself, how that behavior needs to be something that should stop. And that's such an important lesson for us. It almost reminds me a little bit of a few weeks ago when we talked about the image of the yeast of the Pharisees and their teaching and everything, that sin can kind of be like that. You think, I can handle that, but it can permeate the whole thing. What I love about this section is it reminds us that sin doesn't just affect you as an individual, and that's something that in that context, is much more communal. They would be very aware of the fact that sin, it's not just Lee's sin or Janet's sin, but it's our whole community, our church community around us, that it really matters, and we definitely want to take it seriously. So I think that's just such a great lesson for us. We go ahead on to verses 10 through 14, and again talks about the little ones. Don't despise one of these little ones. And it goes on to this story of, if a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And that's an image that we hear about a lot, and it's also captured in Luke. Is that right? Same story. So what do you want us to notice here as we take a look at this beautiful image of God caring for the sheep?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned Luke. Luke tells this story, makes this point using three different parables.
Okay, yes, that's true.
Right? Mm-hmm. There's the lost sheep, and that's the one that Matthew records. Then there's the lost coin. Remember the woman sweeping the house to find their lost coin. And then there's one of the most famous parables of all, the prodigal son, which maybe we should call the lost son. So we got the lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. Matthew only quotes this one example of that story, as you point out, the parable of the shepherd and the wandering sheep. When Jesus begins to tell this story, I love the question he asks. Now, what do you think? There was this shepherd who, and I like that question. He wants to get them thinking about it and pass judgment. He's always engaging the disciples in his teaching and in his ministry. It's kind of like at the feeding of the 5,000. You give them something to eat, huh? And here, now, what do you think about this situation in these little ones? But he goes on and talks about the parable of the lost sheep. First of all, the shepherd makes provision for the 99. It's not that the shepherd doesn't care about the 99 at all. It says in verse 12, he does not. Anyway, he makes provision for the care of the 99. But he goes after the lost ones. And he seeks and searches and finds and rejoices. I like those verbs. Seeks, searches, finds, rejoices.
Those are beautiful.
So Jesus is advocating a certain way of thinking toward people who are just on the verge of faith, or perhaps have come to faith, but it hasn't matured yet. So his point is that even the lowly ones among us, the straying ones, the wandering ones, are worth our attention and our care.
We don't focus on just the ones who seem like they have it together. We go out and seek and find and love and rejoice over them. Yeah. That's beautiful.
One of the most important verses in this story is kind of interesting. It's verse 11. Right before he tells the story, for the Son of Man, and that's how Jesus always referred to himself, came to save the lost. That's a pretty succinct statement, isn't it?
It takes us back to what is his agenda.
Yes,
you mentioned
exactly.
that a few times. Yeah,
exactly. The interesting thing is that in fact, some people might look in their Bibles or in their footnotes. That sentence is not in all Bibles, and the reason it isn't in all Bibles, or maybe it's in brackets, is that it's not in all the ancient manuscripts of Matthew.
Okay.
It's in some of the very old ones and not. But I think the reason why it showed up in some and not in others is that maybe Matthew didn't write it originally in his gospel, but that early Christians knew that Jesus had said that. And so when they came upon a manuscript that didn't have it, they said, oh, I know how Jesus prefaced that story, and they would write it.
They added it in.
They added it in, not because they're adding to the teachings of Jesus, but they're adding to Matthew. Anyway, that's just kind of a little oddity there.
Yeah.
So an important story. I think the story challenges us to say, are we straying? Are we wandering at times? And how would we want people to deal with us as wandering or straying or confused believers? And then what about other strayers or wanderers in our experience, how do we react to them? Do we say, oh, yeah, you had your chance, you're wandering, forget you? We need to have the same kind of high regard for the little ones, the lowly ones that Jesus did.
Yeah, that's great. That we need to seek after them. I like how you mentioned those verbs. Yeah. That's a beautiful story. And then we go ahead on to another verse that's kind of about the community of believers once again. So verses 15 through 20. And it talks about what happens when someone sins against you. And I think this is a passage we can go to a lot at times, like, all right, this is what I'm going to do if someone wrongs me. And sometimes that's almost the tone we take for it here. But as I look at it, it feels like the instructions are actually pretty loving. So what jumps out to you as we take a look at this?
Yeah, I think you're right. In some ways, this flows right out of the previous story that we were just talking about, where he's talking about some believers, maybe immature believers, straying or wandering. And here he names a specific form of wandering or straying, and that is causing offense or sinning, saying something or doing something that is hurtful to another person. So he says, well, what if somebody's hurt you? You know, we were talking about what we do about the hurter. We know what to do about them. We go after them. We seek them. We search for them. We find them. We bring them home. We rejoice with them. But what about you, the hurtee, the person who's been hurt? How do you handle this? And he gives a series of fascinating instructions. First of all, he says, when someone does deeply offend you by their words or actions, it's okay to go to them and just to explain that. By the way, that really hurt when you did that or said that. And the goal, obviously, is not to judge them or to condemn them. That's not where Jesus is going with this. The goal is to get them to say, maybe they'll say, oh, I know, I lost my cool. I said something, I did something. Forgive me. Well, that's a victory, isn't it? Or maybe they say, really, I didn't realize that was offensive to you, or that did hurt you, and I'll be really careful. Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. So the hope in that first stage is that just you and the offender can work it out and come to a reconciliation.
It starts out small and personal, that it wouldn't be, if I hurt you, you're not going around town telling everyone what I did to you, but that you're coming to me in this gentle way. And I think that's kind of what I see as I read it, that it sounds pretty gentle, that hopefully the other person is listening. You just go to them, point out the fault, and hopefully they listen to you.
Yeah. On the other hand, Jesus is realistic, and he realizes that people may get defensive or whatever and not be repentant, and not seek your forgiveness. And if that's the case, well, maybe you need some other mature Christian or two to go with you, someone they'll listen to, someone who could communicate with them better. And so he says in verse 16, if they don't pay attention to you, take a couple other mature Christians along and get them to testify. This really hurt our friends' feelings here. That really undercut their confidence in themselves. And don't you want to seek their forgiveness and things like that? And in his realism, he said, and with some people, that may not work. And so at this point, he does give permission for a fairly drastic form of discipline, doesn't he?
Yes, he says if the person refuses to listen, you tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen to the church, let one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector.
Yeah, there's the fourth stage. Go to them individually, go to them with one or two others, talk about it in the whole loving Christian community based on grace and mercy. And if even that doesn't work, then you're just going to have to start treating them like a Gentile or a tax collector. And this is
the confusing part, right?
This is the confusing, but once you figure it out, and I think we've figured it out.
I hope so.
I know we agree on the interpretation. And I think once we come to that point, it's a beautiful and thrilling and very lovely teaching, don't you think?
Yes, yeah. We were talking before about how one interpretation of this might be, treat them like a Gentile or a tax collector. Get them out of here. They're not part of this community. But as we've seen, and we've talked about this a lot, well, how did Jesus treat Gentiles? Well, he was always pulling them in and inviting them in and going to them. Matthew's a tax collector, so it's interesting imagining him even recounting this story and what that means. And well, how was Matthew treated? He was pulled into the kingdom of God. He was part of this, so that as we look at how Jesus treated tax collectors and Gentiles, he was seeking them out, kind of echoing what we just read. He's seeking after them. He's searching for them. He's ready to respond to them with mercy if they ask for it. Is that how you would think of it?
I think that's exactly what that statement means. Yeah, it's kind of like saying, you know what? You're just going to have to go back to scratch and start loving them like you would have loved someone that you're trying to win to Jesus for the very first time.
I like that, going back to scratch, because the word I think I often hear when we read this passage is, this is a passage about excommunication, and that's a harsh word. I think it sits with me kind of badly, and to think of excommunicating someone versus, okay, I guess we just go back to the beginning and we love them the way we would if they were just starting out their journey of faith, if we knew they didn't know Jesus yet.
My first college teaching opportunity was in Boise, Idaho, and there was a group of churches in the city of Boise that was very evangelistic. They just really were soul winners, and that was kind of their DNA. And they not only tried to convert everybody they talked to. If you met them, they would give you a card with Bible verses, repent and be baptized, every one of you, or whatever. And they also bought big outdoor advertising signs along the highways, and put scripture verses, calling people to faith. And they had professional painters paint scripture verses on their cars. I was so impressed with them when we first moved there, how much they loved other people, Well, I learned as the years passed that they were a very judgmental group of people.
Okay.
And that if you offended somebody within that church, they brought you before the church and excommunicated you, the word that you used. Yes. And from then on, nobody in that congregation was even allowed to speak to you.
Okay.
And it just struck it. I mean, I'm not trying to judge them. It hit me. I realized, oh my goodness, it's possible to, on the one hand, say, we love Gentiles, we love tax collectors, we love sinners, we want them to come to Jesus. But then if there's somebody in our fellowship who does something offensive, the temptation is to just write them off. And Jesus said, no, don't write them off. Go back and do what you were doing in the first place, trying to love them to Jesus. Yeah.
Extend that invitation. Oh, that's great. I mean, this passage, it can be a little bit complicated. And there's a reference once again to the binding and loosing. Did you want to explain that one more time?
I can mention that. The same little trick of grammar is going on here as we saw back in Jesus' comments after the good confession of Peter, where it says, whatever you bind or loose on earth will be bound or loosed in heaven. And what it actually says, although this doesn't come out in most English translations, but it does say, whatever you bind or loose on earth will have already been bound or loosed in heaven. In other words, I think this is a teaching about forgiveness.
Okay.
And what Jesus is saying here is look, how am I going to react to somebody who has offended me? I'll look to God for my example. How does God treat me when I offend God or disobey God? Well, God forgives me.
God shows me mercy.
Yeah, exactly. So, how am I going to treat others? That way. That way. So whatever God, our Heavenly Father, has given.
And so that's what's been bound.
That's what's been bound. That's what we do.
Okay.
If God has forgiven, then we forgive.
That's great.
Yeah. I think that's what's going on
Yeah,
there.
okay. Thank you for explaining that. That's great. And then we go ahead on to some more teachings about forgiveness, verses 21 through 35. And Peter comes to Jesus and says, if my brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And what I love about this is that in that time, it would have been thought as typical of forgiving someone maybe 3 times, that a 4th time would be, you wouldn't do that. You'd be waiting for the person. That would show that they weren't repenting, that they weren't going to change their ways. So here's Peter. It kind of feels like he's once again showing off a little, like as many as 7 times. Look at me, I'm impressive. And Jesus says no, 77 times or more than that even. So yeah, that's where he jumps to. He exaggerates it so much more, and I don't think it's an exaggeration in the sense of that it surely wouldn't be that many. But he's really saying no, forgiveness matters. That you definitely want to forgive. That you shouldn't even be putting a number to it. Tell us more about that. The number has some meaning there as well.
Yeah, it does. The first thing to notice is that Peter really has been listening to Jesus. And he got this thing about treating people. I think he understood when Jesus said treat them like Gentiles or tax collectors. He meant go back and start loving them again all over. And that involves forgiveness to be able to do that. So Peter said, okay, I get that you're talking about forgiving someone who sins against us. But, I mean, how often do I need to do that if they keep violating our trust? And Jesus' answer should not be taken mathematically. I mean, there are numbers here. And I don't know if Peter even meant it mathematically, but Jesus' response is definitely not mathematical. It's hyperbolic, but that was your point. It's also symbolic of a huge number. And the point is, I think, just keep on forgiving. You don't have to keep count. We don't exactly know how to translate the words there. One way to translate it is that Jesus said, but I tell you, not 7, but 77 times. Well, that's a lot. But another way to translate the very same words are 7 times 70 times. Okay. And that would be 490. So that's a lot of time. But as I said, I think Jesus' point is not mathematical. It's symbolic. How often do I forgive? You just keep on forgiving. Because people are going to offend you, dishonor you, put you down, ignore you, whatever. We've got to discipline ourselves to forgive. Jesus loved illustrating his teachings, and he did it so well with parables. And he has a parable here to try to illustrate that. And again, the numbers here are quite exaggerated, aren't they?
Yes, the first person he owes 10,000 talents. And we were talking about that number before. I think I came across something that said that would be like if I owed the amount of money that the United States is currently in debt, which is like trillions of dollars. I have no hope of ever earning enough money. Right. No matter how I invested or if I won all the lotteries in the world, I would not be able to pay that back. So we're talking about just a huge number where this person would be desperate. They would not be able to pay it. So this first person, we see that he gets forgiven. I love, out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him that debt. Yeah. So we start with him in that number.
And I'm going to I like your explanation comparing it to the national debt. I'm going to give a shout out to our brilliant videographer who taught us that a talent is 20 years worth of income for a normal person. And the amount that Jesus uses here is 10,000 talents. So 10,000 times 20 years amount of money, that's the debt.
Wow, that's more than my lifetime. Yeah,
I think that's a little more than your lifetime.
Just a little.
The second slave owes the first slave a pittance compared to that. 100 denarii, it says in verse 28. And I happen to know that a denarius in those days was 1 day's wage, an average 1 day's wage. So this is like saying he owed him the amount that you could, a day laborer would earn in 100 days of work, which is a lot of money and a big portion of somebody's income, but it is actually doable. But that time, forgiveness was not extended, right?
Yeah, he seized him by the throat.
Yeah. So Jesus is just illustrating here the fact that just as God, out of God's great mercy, has forgiven us, so we should always look for opportunities to graciously forgive others, because that's the way God does things.
It's another parable, and as we look at this parable, one thing we want to make sure we keep track of is that in parables, we're not looking for, okay, who's the slave, what's the denarium, what does that represent, picking apart every single piece, but rather that it makes one big point, and that's the point you were just saying, that we see that God forgives, so we ought to forgive. Would you add anything for that?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yes, some parables are allegories, like the parable of the soil and the seed and all that. Each type of soil stands for a certain type of person and response to the good news of the kingdom. Here, though, I think it's less helpful to try, as you say, to identify every character and every amount of indebtedness and all of that, and just say, no, God forgives, we should forgive. Yeah. Good.
Well, we've looked at a lot of different stories today. Are there any themes that jump out to you as we wrap up Matthew 18?
Yeah, there's some big challenges here in terms of self-discipline, the humility that it takes to respect immature Christians. The more mature you get, maybe the more impatient you get with others. You forget, the journey that you've been through. So that kind of humility and hospitality, where we welcome new believers, but then we also kind of give them the space to grow and mature without coming under harsh judgment. What a great teaching that is. And then all this emphasis on being reconciled to people who offend us and forgiving people who offend us. These are big challenges. I mean, it's hard to forgive. I'll just say it, okay? Maybe not for you.
It's hard for everyone, I think, yeah.
It's hard to forgive. And there are certain people who more easily offend us than others. There are certain things that just push our buttons and drive us over the edge. And it's pretty tempting to put limits on our own forgiveness, I think, and say, well, I'll forgive forgive somebody who does that, but I certainly won't forgive that. That's unforgivable. And so this chapter, which, as you say, is the fourth big teaching section, and in each of those teaching sections, Jesus really zeroes in on his close followers. Says, I've got a hard word for you, and this is what it is. So there's a big challenge here. We just need to take it seriously and look for ways to work it out in our lives.
When I think how forgiveness really, it's another trait that happens through humility. You have to be able to lay yourself down a little bit, not think of yourself as the greatest if you're going to be willing to forgive. So we see a lot of important themes here of humility and self-discipline, forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration. And all of these things characterize the kingdom community, the group of followers with Jesus. And that's such an important thing as we remember that at this point, Jerusalem's right around the corner. I think Lee was telling me earlier that Jesus has set his attention towards Jerusalem, and that really means he's thinking about it. He knows what's ahead, that he's about to lay his life down. So I think of these words, these are kind of Jesus's last words to this community. Hey, this is what you're called to do. These are the kind of people you're supposed to be when I'm gone. And that's a high calling for them here to remember what that looks like. And that's the kind of people that we want to aspire to be today, that we would be people of humility, not people seeking greatness, people who forgive, people who seek reconciliation, and reconciliation based out of love. So to ask yourself today, how are you living out those traits? Are those things that you are seeking after? We won't all get it right, but are you able to see how those traits can show up in your life as you echo what Jesus displayed for us in the Bible? That's what we have for us in Matthew 18 this week. I hope to see you again next week.